Muchísimas gracias. De ninguna manera acepto el adjetivo de mujer extraordinaria. Es un gesto de generosidad de su parte, pero quizá lo único que no se dijo en el currículum es que soy una apasionada del Mar Caribe, una enamorada del Mar Caribe y alguien que se ha aproximado al Mar Caribe mexicano desde hace muchísimos años. Agradezco mucho la presencia de todas y todos ustedes en el marco de este espléndido seminario organizado, desde luego, por la Asociación de Estados del Caribe, y quiero agradecer a la maestra Ana Leticia Ramírez Cuevas, directora de Reducción de Riesgo de Desastres, Medio Ambiente y el Mar Caribe, para participar en este foro. Saludo también con gratitud a las instituciones organizadoras, Instituto de Asuntos Marinos de Trinidad y Tobago, y envío un saludo muy fraterno a Trinidad y Tobago. Saludo al Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Medio Ambiente, la Agencia Mexicana de Cooperación para el Desarrollo, AMEXCID, el CINVESTAV del Instituto Politécnico Nacional y el Centro Regional de Capacitación y Transferencia de Tecnología del Convenio de Basilea para el Caribe. Quiero reconocer en los organizadores el haber decidido abordar este tema, porque sin duda es un asunto de la mayor urgencia para todos los países que compartimos la riqueza y desde luego la extraordinaria belleza del Mar Caribe. El Mar Caribe, además de todas las virtudes que han sido abordadas en ponencias previas, que han sido de la mayor calidad, qué importante, yo quisiera solicitar que haya una memoria de las ponencias que se han presentado, que se nos pueda hacer llegar en su momento a los participantes. El Mar Caribe, decía yo, es la principal fuente de sustento para muchos de los países que están establecidos en esa región. No solo en materia turística, que para muchas naciones es su principal fuente de empleo e inversión, sino en una enorme gama de actividades productivas. Tengamos en cuenta que 11% de la captura pesquera del planeta proviene del Mar Caribe. Sin embargo, no obstante esta generosidad con las sociedades ahí establecidas, con las grandes empresas turísticas ahí establecidas, con las grandes empresas navieras que circulan su entorno, el Mar Caribe es también una región olvidada, sobreexplotada, y que resiente la falta de legislación y de políticas públicas integrales que frenen la degradación ambiental y la contaminación de la que es objeto. En este contexto, el papel de los microplásticos es lamentablemente muy grave. Hace algunas semanas leí una nota que relataba el hallazgo de microplásticos en muestras de nieve que recién había caído en la cordillera montañosa de Nueva Zelanda. La pregunta que inspiró el reportaje fue: ¿por qué rastros de microplásticos pueden ser encontrados en regiones tan remotas como el Círculo Antártico, en la cima del monte Everest o en las profundidades del Océano Atlántico? Es decir, en lugares que no han sido alcanzados por la presencia permanente y constante del ser humano. Es increíble. La invasión de los microplásticos nos habla del Armagedón presente. Nos lleva a preguntarnos si la ruta que hemos seguido como especie ha sido la ruta correcta y a replantearnos cómo debe ser el papel del ser humano en la Tierra. La omnipresencia de los microplásticos y la facilidad que tienen para diseminarse en la atmósfera, la tierra y el mar, así como los daños profundos que causan a los ecosistemas del planeta, es tan asombrosa como fúnebre. 8 millones de toneladas de plásticos terminan en el mar cada año. El hallazgo de microplásticos en esos lugares ilustra la gravedad y el alcance de esta forma de contaminación y también es una convocatoria ineludible para actuar. Yo no soy experta en el tema. En este seminario están participando científicos, biólogos marinos, académicos, y sus enseñanzas para mí son muy importantes. Pero asumo mi responsabilidad como ecologista que soy y desde mi papel como legisladora, quiero que sepan que cuentan ustedes con una aliada incondicional en los temas de restauración ecológica en nuestro planeta y particularmente en la región del Mar Caribe. Quiero comentarles desde la trinchera del Senado de la República, en donde participo como integrante de la Comisión de Medio Ambiente y presido la Comisión de América Latina y el Caribe. En el tema de los microplásticos, el sistema de información del Senado de nuestra institución, del Senado mexicano, tiene registradas al menos 26 iniciativas que han sido presentadas y en su caso apoyadas por alrededor de 45 senadoras y senadores. Es decir, casi el 40% de los integrantes del Senado de la República han presentado o apoyado en algún momento a lo largo de estos años de la 64 y 65 legislatura iniciativas en esta materia. Es evidente entonces que en el Poder Legislativo mexicano es un tema del mayor interés. También esto se observa en legislaturas de otros países en la región. Para el caso de México, en noviembre de 2021, las comisiones de Medio Ambiente y de Estudios Legislativos en el Senado de la República se dieron a la tarea de conjuntar este cúmulo de iniciativas para rescatar los elementos más importantes de cada una de ellas y mejorar la Ley General para la prevención y gestión integral de los residuos en materia de plásticos y de residuos sólidos urbanos. El primer punto de planteamiento de esta reforma legal es reconocer que la protección efectiva del medio ambiente, el evitar su deterioro y trabajar en la reconstrucción de los ecosistemas es un derecho humano protegido por la Constitución. Esto es muy importante destacarlo ante especialistas de países de la región caribeña y de América Latina. En el caso mexicano, el, el respeto al medio ambiente y su protección está incorporado como uno de los compromisos constitucionales del Estado mexicano. Esto nos permite tener el marco constitucional que hace posible tengamos diversas leyes reglamentarias ya protegidas, auspiciadas por la Constitución. La contaminación ambiental, y en particular la que proviene de la producción, uso y disposición inadecuada de los plásticos, sobre todo de aquellos que son de un solo uso, pone en riesgo la salud y por tanto el Estado está obligado a intervenir. También el derecho a la salud es un derecho constitucional en el caso de la Constitución mexicana. Debe tomarse en cuenta que la protección al medio ambiente y el control sobre la producción de plásticos de un solo uso también responde a compromisos internacionales que México ha suscrito y que podemos encontrar en el texto de diversos instrumentos y declaraciones. Tal es el caso, la declaración de la Conferencia de las Naciones Unidas sobre el Medio Ambiente y el Desarrollo y la Agenda 21, el Convenio sobre la Diversidad Biológica, el Convenio de Basilea sobre el control de los movimientos transfronterizos de los desechos peligrosos y su eliminación, el Convenio de Estocolmo sobre contaminantes orgánicos persistentes, la Convención Marco de las Naciones Unidas sobre Cambio Climático, la Agenda 2030 para el Desarrollo Sostenible y en el Tratado de Libre Comercio con América del Norte. Menciono algunas, pero eso les revela a ustedes cómo la comunidad internacional ha estado especialmente interesada en este tema y cómo existen una serie de mandatos en los acuerdos internacionales que requieren convertirse en legislación nacional y sobre todo en políticas públicas. En el caso mexicano, la propuesta de reforma que les he mencionado también reconoce que la gestión adecuada de los residuos en México es un reto que se debe atender desde diversos frentes y propone que el país transite hacia un sistema de economía circular. Esto es un modelo que preserve el máximo valor posible de los residuos plásticos a lo largo de su vida, que se apliquen criterios de sustentabilidad para el manejo de la basura con una visión de cero residuos. El modelo de economía circular implica reinsertar los residuos en la cadena económica para eliminar el modelo lineal que simplemente los desecha de forma permanente. La economía circular promueve el rediseño de los productos, lo que, entre otras cosas, implica se eliminen embalajes, empaques, envases y envolturas hechas de plástico que son realmente innecesarias. Es una nueva concepción de el producto no preocupado por cómo fascinar al mercado, sino preocupado por cómo agredir de manera menos severa al medio ambiente. Propone también que la nueva generación de productos que se fabriquen deberá de ser deberá de estar constituida por materiales compostables o reciclables, buscando con ello disminuir su disposición final en rellenos sanitarios. Con esa visión, la reforma a la ley que hemos propuesto busca transitar hacia un modelo de cero residuos y de gestión y manejo eficiente de la basura. Ello implica, entre otras cosas, la eliminación de los plásticos de un solo uso, además de reducir la producción de otro tipo de plásticos. No obstante, el punto central es el manejo y la gestión de residuos sólidos urbanos. También tenemos que tomar en cuenta que en un país federal, como es el caso de México, y de las dimensiones que tiene nuestra patria, cualquier reforma legal debe considerar lo que han hecho ya las entidades federativas y la forma de armonizar las legislaciones en los niveles estatal y municipal. México tiene 32 entidades federativas y somos, en términos constitucionales, una federación, una república federada con 13 poderes de la Unión y estados libres y soberanos. En el continente americano somos una federación vigente con estas características: Estados Unidos, México, Brasil y Argentina. México tiene 32 entidades federativas, de las cuales 9 no tienen una ley estatal sobre el manejo de residuos, pero ya hay un importante avance en más de 20. No obstante esto, diversos estados y municipios han avanzado y aprobado legislación para prohibir el uso de popotes, bolsas de plástico y unicel. La reforma que hemos propuesto también plantea incrementar la conciencia pública y la educación sobre los daños que causan los plásticos de un solo uso. En ese sentido va una primera propuesta a la Asociación de Estados del Caribe. Sería muy útil para el sistema educativo de los países que integran la asociación la realización de un video pedagógico que podamos reproducir en los sistemas educativos y que podamos introducir en los niveles desde la educación básica y la educación media de las instituciones educativas de los estados colindantes con el Mar Caribe. Si hay una cooperación de todos los estados del Caribe y de sus instituciones educativas y una participación de la iniciativa privada, me parece que se podrían hacer un conjunto de videos que se puedan transmitir a las escuelas y complementar con algún instrumento pedagógico con el propósito de incidir en las nuevas generaciones. Esta educación que corte de manera transversal al sistema educativo de los países de la región es indispensable. También es esencial promover ante los consumidores que tengan mayor información sobre el tipo de residuos que generan, la mejor manera de separarlos y el daño que causan si no tienen una actuación responsable. La educación ambiental y la participación de la población se considera clave para el cambio de modelo en el manejo de los residuos y la transición hacia una economía circular y el tratamiento integral de los residuos plásticos. En esta iniciativa planteamos también la existencia de incentivos fiscales para que la acción del reciclamiento resulte rentable, tanto para la industria como para los particulares que intervienen en este proceso. Y planteamos la colaboración activa de la población y del sector privado para que el otorgamiento de incentivos fiscales estimule la cooperación y la responsabilidad en la materia. Esta legislación ya fue aprobada por el Senado mexicano y se encuentra actualmente en la Cámara de Diputados para proseguir con el proceso legislativo. Este es un seminario internacional. Haré algún breve comentario sobre la experiencia internacional en materia legislativa. A nivel internacional, un estudio realizado por el Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Medio Ambiente observó que para 2018, 127 países de 192 evaluados cuentan con algún tipo de legislación relativa al control sobre las bolsas de plástico. De ellos, 91, es decir, aproximadamente el 72%, especifican algún tipo de prohibición o restricción a la fabricación o a la producción, la importación y la distribución al por menor de bolsas de plástico. 83 países han adoptado la prohibición expresa de la distribución de bolsas de plástico en el comercio minorista. 27 países han promulgado leyes que prohíben productos específicos como platos, vasos, popotes o envases fabricados con plástico, poliestireno. Otros 27 países han establecido impuestos a la fabricación de bolsas de plástico y 30 establecieron el cobro obligatorio de las bolsas al consumidor final. Es decir, los establecimientos comerciales no las pueden regalar. 43 países han establecido en sus legislaciones obligaciones adicionales para los productores de bolsas de plástico. En 63 legislaciones se obliga a los productores a intervenir en el reembolso de los productos reciclados y su recuperación. Solo en 8 de los 192 países analizados existen menciones a la prohibición de las micropartículas. Estos 8 países son Canadá, Estados Unidos, Francia, Italia, Nueva Zelanda, Corea del Sur y Gran Bretaña. Es importante mencionar que en todas las legislaciones analizadas se encontró una prohibición total a la producción de plásticos desechables o de un solo uso. Existen excepciones para determinados productos o materiales, como los de uso médico o los llamados plásticos biodegradables. En América Latina, Debemos mencionar que los pequeños estados insulares han sido más proclives a promulgar prohibiciones sobre el uso de plásticos desechables. No obstante, solo 6 países en América Latina y el Caribe están en esa lista: Argentina, Costa Rica, Dominica, Haití, Guyana y San Vicente y las Granadinas. Haití es el único país en la región que prohíbe la fabricación y uso de bolsas de plástico en el mercado minorista, mientras que Colombia, Chile y Panamá prohíben solo su distribución. Antigua y Barbuda, así como Paraguay, prohíben también la importación de bolsas de plástico. El resto de los países de la región, en el mejor de los casos, solo contemplan prohibiciones parciales. En la actualidad, 27 de los 33 países de la región de América Latina y el Caribe han establecido legislación nacional o local con miras a la reducción, prohibición y o eliminación de los plásticos desechables. No obstante, solo 5 contemplan responsabilidad ampliada del productor. Esto es, el traslado de responsabilidad, ya sea física o económica, hacia los productores de recolectar, tener la obligación de recolectar sus productos e invertir en la infraestructura para su tratamiento. Por lo que toca la reglamentación sobre las bolsas de plástico, solo los siguientes países en América Latina y el Caribe tienen esquemas legales de responsabilidad extendida: Antigua y Barbuda, Bahamas, Bolivia, Paraguay y Uruguay. Por ejemplo, en Brasil existe la responsabilidad del productor de recolectar los envases al final de su vida útil y alcanzar la meta de reducir el 22% de los residuos de envases que terminan en los basureros y que desde luego muchos terminan en el océano Atlántico. También destaca el caso de Venezuela, Belice y Uruguay, que tienen esquemas para obligar a los distribuidores y vendedores a cobrar un depósito por los envases de bebidas al momento de la venta y reembolsar el valor del mismo cuando estos son retornados por parte de los consumidores. También hay medidas legales en solo 7 países de América Latina y el Caribe que obligan al reciclaje de productos de plástico: Barbados, Bolivia, Brasil, Cuba, Panamá, Perú y Uruguay. Para el caso de reciclaje de bolsas de plástico y otros productos de un solo uso, solo Brasil, Bolivia, Paraguay y Uruguay contemplan medidas de esa naturaleza en sus legislaciones. Por lo que toca a imposiciones de orden fiscal, 29 países han aplicado un impuesto para la fabricación de plásticos de un solo uso, que en principio se explica para compensar el potencial daño que dichos productos pueden generar al medio ambiente. La mayor parte de estos impuestos están orientados hacia la producción de bolsas de plástico. Dominica, Jamaica, Colombia y Paraguay tienen legislación en esa materia. Estimadas amigas, estimados amigos, fue un rápido vistazo a la situación legislativa en la región y una mención a los esfuerzos iniciales que se realizan en el Parlamento mexicano. Yo quisiera apuntar a manera de respetuosas sugerencias a la Asociación de Estados del Caribe y ofrecer mi colaboración para que en el marco del Parlamento Latinoamericano, institución de la que he sido presidenta y cuya sede está en Panamá y que ahora represento en la vicepresidencia de México, podamos realizar un encuentro con las comisiones de medio ambiente del Parlamento Latinoamericano, una invitación a las comisiones de medio ambiente de América Latina y el Caribe, y con la colaboración de la Asociación de Estados del Caribe, podamos hacer un gran encuentro para que establezcamos compromisos mínimos en materia legislativa que podamos legislar en todos los países. Y quiero hacer una mención específica a el tema del sargazo, pues no puedo desaprovechar esta oportunidad con tan importantes expertos en la problemática del Caribe. En investigaciones científicas sobre el sargazo, se ha descubierto que el sargazo, como otras algas, contiene alginatos y hay alguna probabilidad de que se pueda desarrollar a partir de esos alginatos la producción de plásticos biodegradables. Tenemos que buscar la alternativa de que la tragedia y la plaga del sargazo se vuelva una posibilidad constructiva con su adecuada recolección y transformación. Dejo la mención sobre la posibilidad de producir plástico biodegradable a través del sargazo e invito a los científicos que nos están escuchando y en el marco de la Asociación de Estados del Caribe para que desarrollemos un protocolo de investigación en esa materia. Creo que en el caso del sargazo será indispensable empujar un tratado internacional que permita la colaboración y la coadyuvancia de todos los países de la región para atender ese problema que no solo es periódico, sino que todo indica que por el cambio climático será permanente. Muchísimas gracias por su atención. Listo, no podía desactivar el silencio. Desde la esfera legislativa no hubo ninguna actuación distinta a la que regía en cualquier condición. Desconozco si en el ámbito del Ejecutivo de la estructura de salud hubo algún acuerdo específico. Lo que sí fue muy claro y implicó un esfuerzo de modificación de conductas, es que el control de los plásticos hacia el interior de hospitales y de áreas de diagnóstico o de áreas de concentración de las personas que estaban convaleciendo de COVID fue mucho más riguroso y el confinamiento de los plásticos que se utilizaron o de el tipo de uniformes, cubrebocas, cubrecabellos, etcétera, siendo de un solo uso, fue confinado con mucho mayor eficacia, mucha mayor prestancia y que su destrucción fue hecha con todas las normas que en materia sanitaria exigen para el desecho, para el manejo de desecho de insumos sanitarios.
En energía,
El, la madera varada es muy importante, como bien se mencionó por el especialista Rangel, que a lo mejor somos parientes, señor especialista Rangel, porque mi segundo apellido es Rangel. Entonces, hay que tener la noción completa del ecosistema por eso y ver las ventajas y las desventajas, pero en el caso del sargazo, evidentemente, la concentración de microplásticos también genera condiciones de mayor riesgo cuando el sargazo llega a la costa. El, un saludo a la doctora Dalila Aldana, que por cierto es una de mis mentoras en el aprendizaje del manejo y de la comprensión de la problemática medioambiental del mar Caribe. Me parece que necesitamos hacer un gran esfuerzo y compromiso desde la base de la sociedad y desde la base de la autoridad. Creo que otra actividad que podríamos sugerirle a la Asociación de los Estados del Caribe es que hiciéramos una convocatoria a las legislaturas locales y a las presidencias municipales y pudiese darse un gran curso de capacitación. La especialidad medioambiental debe dejar de ser una ciencia que conozcan esencialmente los expertos. Los expertos nos deben extender la mano para que las personas que trabajan en los municipios, que forman parte de las direcciones de medio ambiente y ecología, que forman parte de las direcciones de servicios, las personas que trabajan en los estados, comprendan la trascendencia de la política medioambiental y su aplicación. Necesitamos estimular una gran vocación medioambientalista. Necesitamos un gran pacto para rescatar el mar Caribe. Y creo que con las ventajas de estos instrumentos tecnológicos para informar y para capacitar, se podría hacer un extraordinario curso donde se examinen los riesgos fundamentales de la contaminación en el mar Caribe y podamos desarrollar líneas de acción. Y en el caso de los legisladores, podemos establecer un acuerdo de monitoreo de la aplicación de las leyes con las entidades federativas. Se lo voy a proponer a la Comisión de Medio Ambiente, porque tiene razón la doctora Aldana, que de nada sirve tener legislación avanzada si esta no se aplica y hay que aplicarla a través del convencimiento, a través de la explicación, a través de la información, a través de la generación de conciencia, pero si esto no tiene resultados, también a través de las sanciones que establecen las propias leyes. En primer lugar, me emociona mucho las expresiones. Quiero informarle eh, al secretario ejecutivo del Convenio de Cartagena eh, que me emociona además porque la primera actividad que hice cuando tomé posesión de la Comisión de América Latina y el Caribe fue ratificar el Convenio de Cartagena. Entonces, le tengo enorme fe a ese instrumento y estoy convencida si unimos la buena voluntad y la decisión de trabajar por la región y la restauración de su medio ambiente y la protección, la sinergia positiva de todas las instituciones involucradas seguramente rendirá muy buenos frutos y cuenten con toda mi disposición tanto en el Congreso mexicano como para hacer un enlace con el Parlamento latinoamericano. ¿Eh? ¿No están? Si me permiten, cierro de mi parte. eh, Amigo Martinelli, quiero decirle que estamos a sugerencia de la doctora Dalila Aldana proponiendo que uno de los buques emblemáticos de la Marina Mexicana, el buque Escuela, pueda apoyar a los científicos y a los académicos en la investigación sobre microplásticos, recogiendo agua de todas las regiones a donde van y apoyando con una alianza positiva con la academia su procesamiento y su investigación. Coincido con usted, creo que es un tema muy importante que podemos abordar también desde las comisiones de Marina que existan en los congresos o las comisiones de Marina Mercante. Así es que una nota sobre el tema para nosotros sería de enorme utilidad. Qué bueno que hubo las reacciones positivas de compartir conocimientos y experiencias en torno al sargazo. Así es que qué bueno que todos estamos unidos por una misma preocupación, unidos por un mismo propósito y convencidos de que el Mar Caribe merece toda nuestra pasión y todo nuestro esfuerzo para protegerlo. Muchas gracias a la Asociación de Estados del Caribe y a todos los organizadores.
Thank you, Director Ramirez. All protocols observed. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm Shalina Rapel. So today I'll be talking a bit about best practices at landfills by presenting a case study on the project entitled Improving the Caroni Ramsar Nature Reserve, Reducing the Impact of Beetham Landfill and Surroundings in Trinidad. Next, please. So litter in wetlands, oceans, and seas can lead to a loss of biodiversity and ecosystem functions. So microplastics have emerged as a pollutant of concern. The high surface area of microplastics, along with characteristics like high hydrophobicity, enhances the risk of plasticizer leaching, that is the desorption and adsorption of hazardous chemicals and pathogens. Waste from disposal sites near the coastline can serve as a significant source of marine litter. The Beetham landfill is a non-engineered municipal waste disposal site situated at the edge of the Caroni Ramsar Nature Reserve. It's a protected site, and at the Beetham landfill, there is commingling of waste and there is no leachate barrier system in place. So this can lead to uncontrolled dispersion of leachates and litter from the capital city into the Caroni Swamp and then into the Gulf of Paria. This, along with the wastewater from Port of Spain, is a significant source of contamination, and it can contribute to loss of biodiversity and ecosystem functions within the Caroni Swamp. Next, please. So the project proposes an initial assessment of the spread of the litter and assessment of options for pollution capture and preparation of a final funding package to request this funding from international organizations. We also plan to present the results to the region via an online workshop. The project began in March 31st, 2022 and will span for 12 months. It's estimated at €125 for the project budget. The project is funded by the Tau Foundation in the Netherlands, and it's being implemented by a consortium led by the BCRC-Caribbean and comprising of the Trinidad and Tobago Solid Waste Management Company Limited, SWIMCOL, and Tau BV. Next, please. The project is comprised of 4 phases. It is phase 1, which involves a site assessment and inventory of the sources and pathways. Phase 2 would involve the conceptualization of solutions for limiting the impact on the swamp. Phase 3 involves the preparation of a funding package and outreach to funding organizations, and presentation of the results and outreach to the region via an online workshop will make up phase 4. The deliverable under phase 1 of the project would be the detailed site investigation report, which focuses on the environmental quality of leachate, surface water, and sediment, with a view to developing a map of the Beetham landfill and the potentially leachate impacted area of the Caroni Swamp. This would include surrounding receptors and pollution sources, investigating the pollution migration of sediments from the Beetham landfill and secondary pollution sources, including possibilities for using concentrations of metalloids for microplastic migration and sediments at the disposal sites. It would involve also updating the conceptual site model of the Beetham landfill and potentially leachate contaminated area of the swamp. Next, please. So as mentioned, microplastics are emerging as a pollutant of importance due to the high risk of plasticizer leaching, and this compounds the impact of these pollutants on human health and the environment. Landfills are repositories for the cumulative loading of plastic waste. The contribution of these sites as potential sources of microplastics remains poorly researched. Microplastics consist of a wide range of synthetic and semi-synthetic materials that are comprised mainly of polymers. You have your polyethylene terephthalate, your PET, your LDPEs and HDPEs, that's your low density and high density polyethylene in your plastic bags and bottle caps. The PVC, polyvinyl chloride, and plumbing pipes, garden hoses, electrical installation. And in Trinidad, you find that the cables for electrical equipment are often burned to extract the metals inside. So the plastic and other harmful contaminants within them in the PVC are released to the environment. And then you have your polypropylene used in manufacture of bottle caps, carpets, and this has a low density, so it floats on water. And the polystyrene found in disposable cutlery, dinnerware, and your takeaway food packaging, which is significant in Trinidad as well. At the Beetham landfill, we have a unique situation as it's situated at the edge of the Ramsar Nature Reserve, and the Beetham landfill leaches microplastics into the Carney swamp. Your sewage water also contributes largely to the microplastics in the mangroves. The microplastics behave a bit differently in mangrove systems than they do in other systems due to the varying salinities, the fluctuating water levels, and the settling velocities, which is significant since the plastic itself is not the only concern where you have the plastic taking long to settle, it goes a bit further, and you have your toxins leaching into the water for a bit longer. So we would have conducted a preliminary site assessment where the current studies on the toxic effect of the microplastics were found to focus mainly on animal ingestion. And as far as desktop research under this project would have shown, there was no data available on the microplastic bioaccumulation by mangrove vegetation or on the growth of the mangrove vegetation. So environmental monitoring data was taken where the Carney swamp meets the Beetham landfill, and we would have tested for, the biochemical oxygen demand, the chemical oxygen demand, total suspended solids, arsenic, iron, lead, nickel, fecal coliform. To preliminary assess the impact, specifically the migration of the litter and leachate throughout the swamp, the source receptor pathways were investigated. The primary potential source of litter and leachate towards the Carney swamp would have been the accumulated waste of the landfill. This primary source was assessed through the collection of 3 samples of surface waste and leachate in the direct vicinity, as well as 100 sediment samples, analyzing them for microplastics, metalloids, organic pollutants, and pathogens. These samples were collected to evaluate for suitable nature-based solutions to minimize the impact on the landfill, which would comprise phase 2 of the project. Next, please. Can we switch a slide, please? Confirming that you can hear me. Okay, one more forward. We missed this one. Thank you. Can we move one more forward, please? Thanks. So at the Beetham landfill, the sediment and leachate samples were collected at the end of April. They were analyzed from 4 main locations. Go back one slide. Thank you. Thanks. Sample location 1 was upstream of the landfill. Location 2 was on the perimeter. Location 3 was downstream, and location 4 was towards the center of the landfill where we found the fecal ponds. These samples were tested against the Trinidad and Tobago water pollution rules, as well as against the maximum concentrations for inland surface water, and protection of aquatic life and aquatic ecosystems were also considered. Next slide, please. Noting that the catchment of the Carney River would cover a large part of the northern range, many of the residences and industrial sites were directly or indirectly discharging wastewater to the Carney River and the tributaries. And to determine the impact on the landfill, the main focus was on the migration of litter and leachate throughout the sediments found in the Carney swamp. These sediments were classed as both pathway, which were metalloids binding to the sediment particles, and receptors of the pollutants. The aquatic organisms living in the sediment would be the final receptors along with humans who would consume these organisms. So we identified some secondary sources during the site visits. There was wastewater from the Beetham estate flowing upstream of the landfill into the swamp, wastewater from the Fernandez plant upstream from the landfill into the swamp, Wassa wastewater situated to the west of the landfill, and litter and wastewater from the Carney River into the swamp during high tide. Next slide, please. We also noted some visual observations in that some sections of the mangrove seemed healthy while it was clear that other parts were dead. We noted high amounts of macroplastic distributed throughout the mangrove, varying sizes, and they included but were not limited to plastic bottles, caps, bags, styrofoam. We noted oil and tar discharge, presence of black vultures, and cable nesting areas. During the study, next slide, please. Sorry. It was noted that additional investigation was necessary to get a more holistic view of the contaminant, the knowledge gaps. Can we go back one slide, please? Thank you. To get a bigger picture of the contaminants and hydrological situation at the Beetham landfill, we would have needed additional investigations. We noted some key knowledge gaps here. A detailed overview of the hydrological processes and water balance, for example, inflowing surface water, sinks, leachate outflow, it was lacking. The exact volume of petroleum waste and impacted sediments was not determined. And in addition, detailed observations on the preferential pathways, streams towards south and southeast were also lacking. The assessment of leachate and sediment quality was only completed on a limited set of parameters, and no information was made available on the concentration of micropollutants in the sediment and leachate samples. Although the mangroves seem to be healthy in large parts of the area, the impact is unclear. There's no information on the concentration of contaminants present in the aquatic organisms used for commercial purposes like crabs. There was also no information on leachate quality to the northeast, the northern and western edges. No data was obtained on preferential pathways directly east of the landfill, nor on the exact extent of the area with signs of leachate present. No deep drillings were installed to determine the thickness and continuity of the peat deposit. Groundwater quality underneath the landfill and the direct vicinity was also unknown, and specifically the impact of the leachate on the regional sand and gravel aquifer around 30 meters below the surface. And also a complete risk assessment was not done. Moving forward to the recommendations, please. So it's clear that the Beetham landfill is posing a risk to the mangrove and the ecosystem there. In some sections, it seems as though the mangrove is losing its buffering capacity for the contaminants coming from the landfill. Additional sources of pollution and the distorted hydrological system can further contribute to a situation which will continue to deteriorate. And to mitigate and reverse this situation, we have put forward some recommendations. First, we can limit or prevent further dumping of the total petroleum hydrocarbons in the landfill through stricter gate control or control of the subcontractors operating on the landfill. We can upgrade the leachate collection system at the landfill, upgrade or remediate the tar and petroleum hydrocarbon lake to the south of the landfill. We can also install a new buffer zone to act as a nature-based solution for the leachates coming from the landfill. We can reduce the leachate, which would include the litter and microplastics coming from the Beetham landfill, and reinstate the natural hydrological system of this part of the Carney swamp by ensuring in and outflow of the clean water into the area. And considering that the uptake and execution of these actions would require significant time and budget, phase 3 and phase 4 of the project would have a built-in mechanism to aid with this. So to recap, the key deliverable coming out of phase 1 would be the report and the assessment of the physical and chemical analytical results of the field investigation that was conducted to inform phase 2, which involves the review of the possible technical solutions for a leachate barrier system for reducing microplastic outflow, and a remediation assessment to select the best technical solution and conceptual design of the best technical solutions. And this would highlight the importance of phase 3 and phase 4 of the project, where we will prepare a funding package for outreach to funding organizations, along with presentation of the results and outreach to the region through an online workshop. This would ensure that the implementation of the best technical solution is adequately funded and taken up for execution to effectively achieve the aim of introducing and transferring knowledge on the best available practices for determining migration of litter, including microplastics, and implementing pollution capture at non-engineered disposal sites situated at litters, and in this case, the Cartagena swamp. To segue a bit, next slide, to talk about the plastic waste management activities under the Jeff Islands program, implementing sustainable low and non-chemical development in small island developing states. Next, please. So the overarching objective of the Jeff Islands program would be to states to enter into a safe chemical development pathway in the Atlantic, Indian, Caribbean, and Pacific regions. And in the Caribbean, we have Jeff Islands 10279 with Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Belize, the Dominican Republic, Guyana, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, and Jeff Islands 10472 with the Bahamas, Cuba, and Dominica. The program and projects are comprised of the 4 components you see here. Component 1 is on prevention of future buildup chemicals entering the SIDS. Component 2 on the safe management and disposal of existing chemicals, products, and materials. Component 3 on safe management of the products entering SIDS and closing material and product loops for these products. And component 4 on knowledge management and communication. Next, please. To highlight the island's Caribbean plastic waste management activities, component 1 on the future buildup prevention, the future buildup of chemicals in SIDS, output 1.1 would involve the development of legislative and institutional framework for the environmentally sound management of hazardous chemicals and materials, products, and waste at both national and regional levels in the 12 project countries, and plastic waste would be one of the waste streams examined through this output. This would involve the conduct of detailed assessments into existing policies, legislation, and institutional waste capacities in the countries to manage hazardous chemicals and waste, inclusive of specific waste streams like electrical and electronic equipment and its waste, the end-of-life vehicles, plastics, and mercury-added products and their waste. Component 3 on the safe management of products entering SIDS and composing material and product loops for these products. We'll see that the objective of this activity would be to assess plastic waste generation from the cruise ship sector, particularly in the Dominican Republic and the Bahamas, and determine how to process the plastic waste parallel to municipal waste in an environmentally sound manner. For this activity in both the Dominican Republic and the Bahamas, Carnival Cruise Line would be a key stakeholder and involved throughout. Then in the first phase, we have data collection, stakeholder engagements, and consultations. And in the second phase there, recommendations will focus on how the plastic waste generated at the cruise centers can be managed in an environmentally sound manner within the municipal solid waste management system in these countries. The aim of this activity would be to reduce the stress of plastic waste on the environment in small island states and municipalities reliant on the cruise industry. Therefore, a concentrated aim to manage cruise ship waste would be needed and supported by international cruise line associations, and the development of policy that can be adapted to national context and adopted across regions would also be beneficial here. For activity 3.3.2, the harmful plastics, PVCs, and agricultural plastic packaging and their ESM in 6 of the 12 project countries would be addressed. And this information will be used to develop strategies to divert PVC waste from selected sectors and agricultural plastic waste from landfills to treat these plastic streams in an environmentally sound manner. And we will examine the agricultural sector in the Bahamas, Cuba, and Dominica, the construction sector in the Bahamas, Barbados, Cuba, Dominica, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago, PVC manufacturing sector in Trinidad and Tobago, and the tourism and hospitality sector in Barbados and Cuba. Component 4, knowledge management and communication, we would see activity 4.1.3, the implementation of the Plastic Tide Tennis Challenge program in 9 of the project countries. And this program was developed under the Clean Seas campaign and launched in 2019. It has been implemented in 32 countries thus far since April 2022. The target audience for this program would be the youth between 11 to 25 years, and key groups would include Scouts, Junior Achievement, Girl Guides, secondary and tertiary school students. Consultants here would coordinate the implementation of the program to ensure that targets are met, and work with national implementing partners and other advocacy networks interested in preventing plastic pollution. The aims of this program would be to engage the youth across the globe to address plastic pollution threatening life in oceans, rivers, and on land, and to motivate the youth to alter behavior and norms around plastic usage at both individual and community levels. So next, we have a video to highlight the Jeff Island's Caribbean Child Projects. On the next slide. If we can go ahead and play the video, please. Can we click the video to play, please? Okay. I can provide a link. 1 second, please. No, I'm not having. Sorry about the technical difficulties. We'll share a link so that the video can be played shortly. you. And I think we can move to the last slide there. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your time and attention. Sorry, we're having a bit of technical difficulty with the audio, so we're unable to hear you. If there are further questions, we can type the responses in the chat, or for those who would like more information, you can email info@bcrc-caribbean.org.
Okay. Is everyone hearing me now? I was making sure I was unmuted. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. Apologies for slight technical days. Just as a point of introduction, Corbin, I'm currently coordinator. And from the leadership, very, very important webinar. We are pleased to have been part of the support organizing team, and I also really acknowledge the excellent presentation that this has helped this particular presentation. I wanted to start perhaps with a bit of a global perspective in terms of what is driving the policy agenda for us in the Caribbean, and particularly to highlight the United Nations UNEP, people who of the that we have to address, but we have to litter that the United Nations Environment Program functions as a secretariat, but it is a multi-stakeholder partnership. There's a website, there's a digital platform, and one of the purposes of that is to really bring together research and policymakers. As you've heard before, there are many, many publications out there, and as it relates to policy and legislation, I wanted to highlight a number of publications that have been done over the last 5 or 6 years in particular. All of these are available freely online, and I am aware that many governments are using these to help establish their individual national policies and regulations. But I would say there is still an opportunity for more exchange among us within the region. There have been some specific studies done. For example, there's a case study on the economic implications of the single-use plastic ban using a case study of Trinidad and Tobago. There was a recent publication by the Duke University looking at 20 years of government responses to the global plastic pollution problem, and a number of other publications which again provide recommendations as to how might we as a region approach the development of policy and regulation. I don't need to go much into this image. We've heard just how significant the problem of marine litter and plastic pollution is. We've heard that there needs to be a significant focus on land-based sources of marine pollution because that's where most of the plastics are generated. But I wanted to use this slide to also highlight, which I think was mentioned in the last presentation, that we also need to look at seabed sources, particularly abandoned, discarded, lost fishing gear, and the fact that microplastics is also reported to being discharged in ballast water, in bilge water, and in wastewater that comes from ships. I wanted to begin the core of this presentation with touching on some of the regional frameworks which exist. As you've heard, the Cartagena Convention is the only regional legally binding agreement for protection of the Caribbean Sea. This is a bit of the evolution of the convention from 1972 when UNEP first established the framework of the regional seas. We represent the regional seas for the wider Caribbean region. And the convention itself was adopted in 1983 and entered into force in 1986. More specifically, under the convention are 3 sub-agreements, and the one which forms the framework for looking at marine pollution, particularly pollution of plastics and pollution of waste, is our land-based sources of marine pollution protocol, which was adopted in 1999 and entered into force in 2010. And specifically, it addressed pollution not just from land-based sources and activities, but pollution from ships, which is actually governed by an international convention called MARPOL, and pollution caused by dumping, which is again administered by the International Maritime Organization through the London Convention and the Dumping Protocol. Governments have already indicated a strong political commitment to addressing marine pollution in terms of the numbers of countries that have ratified or formally signed on to the land-based sources of marine pollution protocol. 26 out of 28 countries have actually ratified the Cartagena Convention. But as you see from the dark green, we still have a ways to go in getting other governments within Latin America and the Caribbean to sign on to the protocol, which demonstrates a political commitment that we are ready to do something about the issue of pollution and waste management. We have conferences of parties like many of the other global multilateral environmental agreements. And I want to again highlight some of the regional policy frameworks which exist and some of our recent decisions. We have both a regional marine litter action plan and strategy for the Caribbean. We recently developed in 2019 a state of marine pollution report on the Caribbean Sea. And at our last conference of parties, governments recognized and identified plastics as a high priority and agreed to form a technical subgroup on plastics comprising of representatives of contracting parties. And this subgroup would help guide the Secretariat in terms of what are some of the major actions that can be taken. During the presentations on Monday and Tuesday of this week, there was quite a bit of discussion on the importance of harmonized analytical methods. And I just want to emphasize how critical that is and needs to be. Through a cooperation with the Regional Seas Program for the Northwest Pacific, OSPA, we worked with a consultant in Bonaire to help look at a harmonized marine litter monitoring in the wider Caribbean region. And this took on board the aspects relating to the different approaches that are being used for monitoring in the wider Caribbean region. You have persons using methodology from the Ocean Conservancy. You have persons utilizing methodology from the Environmental Protection Agency, persons using methodologies from NOAA. And we also took on board what methodologies were being used in other regional seas programs, such as the Barcelona Convention in the Mediterranean, as well as the OSPA Commission. And this was an attempt to try to get the best of all of them. And we would recommend for those who are involved in beach cleanups to take a look at some of these monitoring methodologies. Okay, so somehow it has stopped moving. Let me see what's happening here. Okay, I think it is my video. I actually don't have any overlapping windows anymore, so I'm just trying to see what's happening now. All right, I think if someone could just give me a thumbs up that they hear me again, I'll just stop the video for the time being. I'm not sure if I see a thumbs up to continue. Perfect. So this is, and I really wanted to show this video, so I'm happy it came up. This is the result of some modeling work that was done by the Florida State University. And it really reinforces, I think, why it's so important for us to work on this in terms of regional approaches. They started off by looking at a global model about the movement of materials from West Africa and Western Europe into the Caribbean and into the Caribbean Sea. And they then continued by looking at a regionalized model in terms of where would potentially microplastics move within the Caribbean Sea. I wanted to show this because it highlights a few things. It highlights that there are microplastics that are coming from outside of the region, a transboundary movement from West Africa and Western Europe, but there's also the discharge of microplastics and plastics from within the wider Caribbean region. And this really means that we do have to approach this at a regional level. What this modeling work also demonstrates is that there are certain hotspots you would notice around the Bahamas, you would notice in the Gulf of Mexico, that you would notice also in parts of Central America, that a significant amount of particles seem to be accumulating in that area. What would be useful to see is whether our science and our research and our by the scientists and researchers here actually show a similar pattern. So I wanted to continue a little bit with the regional partnership that we have established under the Global Partnership of Marine Litter. And this is a regional mechanism that is co-hosted by the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute and the Cartagena Convention Secretariat. And it forms a framework for cooperation among national and regional organizations, among governments, research and technical agencies that are all focusing on the issue of marine litter. Through the node, we have provided grants for various activities, mainly grants to community-based organizations, and we continue to facilitate research and activities relating to marine litter and plastics management. Critically, for the policy changes that we need to have at national and regional level in the region, we need partnerships. And I'm happy to say that the Cartagena Convention Secretariat and UNEP in general have been able to developed partnerships with a number of different agencies. I made mention of other UN organizations, such as the International Maritime Organization, other regional seas, such as OSPA, certainly the Association of Caribbean States, non-governmental organizations. But we've also engaged with some private sector organizations, the Caribbean Tourism Organization and the Sandals Foundation, with young people, the Caribbean Youth Environment Network, research institutes, and I think two of them made presentations during this particular webinar, INVEMA from Columbia and St. George's University, but also the donors, the Global Environment Facility, the government of Germany, and the European Union have all funded projects that we are working on relating to plastics management. We realized that in order to set the policy agenda, we also need to have publications and work that is relevant to us at the regional level. And I mentioned the regional marine litter strategy. I've mentioned our regional action plan and the marine litter monitoring approach. But we also have a number of videos that were produced. One of them is called Breaking Up with Plastics. That was done as part of a Global Environment Facility funded project for Caribbean small islands. We have a number of knowledge products that were developed through the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute. So these are a material that can be used in a lot of our public awareness, education, and outreach efforts. I want to highlight now really what are some of the challenges in terms of policy development that we have found in the research in the region. And one of these certainly is with regard to the recycling industry in general and the lack of policy frameworks to ensure that there is effective recycling. We noticed that there is not a lot happening with regard to extended producer responsibility outside of the European Union. And one of the weaknesses, of course, was the lack of a global legal framework to facilitate collective action on plastics. We are happy to say that that journey has begun, but it doesn't mean that we still can't keep doing activities on the ground while we negotiate such a global agreement. There's no common agreement as yet as to what are the most problematic plastics, and that's where the input of researchers and scientists are going to be so critical. We need to understand what are the risks, what do these levels of microplastics in the environment mean, where are the major plastic leakages into the environment, so that when we put in place solution measures, we are identifying the high priority issues. And we have to sort of address the elephant in the room. We are aware that there is pressure from plastic manufacturers not to advance on legislation. And as we've heard from the senator this morning, legislation and regulations are extremely critical, not to mention their enforcement, in order to make progress on this issue. We've heard during the first few days of the webinar that we still have substantially challenges with solid waste management systems, particularly as it relates to prevention, collection, recycling, reuse, recovery, and I would add to that port reception facilities. In some of the reviews that we've done, we've seen that there has been some effort by many countries to update national solid waste management policies, strategies, laws, but many of them are still very much outdated. And very few countries have also put in place policies and legislation relating to how are they going to deal with ship-generated waste at their various ports, and in particular at smaller marinas and anchorages. We've also realized, as many of you have stated throughout the week, there is a lack of data and information. And when we do have the data and information, it's not being centralized in one place that would allow policymakers and decision makers to have access to the data and to have that data influence policy decisions. Particularly, we recognize that there was lack of data on plastic use, sources, alternatives, and impacts. There was a lack of data and information on appropriate business models. Many Caribbean countries in particular have received proposals for looking at waste to energy or plastics to energy, but we still need some more information in order to guide decision-making on that. A number of Latin American, Caribbean countries have also implemented single-use plastic bans, but there has been less work on monitoring whether or not those bans have been fully effective, what have been the implications of these bans, particularly at a socioeconomic level in terms of environmental improvements. And some countries implemented bans without having appropriate alternatives already in place. And then we need to look at how are we going to really incentivize or disincentivize the private sector to become more involved in improving plastics management. What are we doing? We're working with a number of development partners, and this webinar is an example of that, to help build the human, technical, and financial capacity for waste management in supporting countries and governments in developing national integrated waste management policies, strategies, and action plans, and also looking for cost-effective approaches at both regional and sub-regional level for activities such as waste diversion, recycling, and upcycling. If we don't manage solid and plastic waste on land or at sea, inevitably we will result in microplastics. There is no way we can clean up microplastics that are already in the environment. It has to be about prevention at source. So what I'd like to do over the next few slides, and this is not an all-inclusive list, I just want to provide listeners with a snapshot of some of the policy responses that we've seen throughout the wider Caribbean region in terms of addressing the issue of plastics. Many governments are making changes to national policies, legislation, and regulations. Many governments have started processes for developing national, sub-regional, or regional marine litter action plans. One of the most recent you may have heard was a launching of the Panama National Marine Litter Action Plan. Earlier this year, we had the launch of the Central American Marine Litter Action Plan. These action plans that are developed can be replicated and upscaled either at national level and regional level. And I would throw out a bit of a challenge. Do you think that these strategies and plans are really being adequately informed by some of the science and research that we've heard over this week? I want to touch on one of the plans that's been in place for some time now, one that was done in Brazil. Just to pull out a couple of key elements, they focused a lot on governance. They tried to identify what was the vision, the desired scenario. They put in place guidelines, indicators, response measures. There was a project that UNEP through the Brazil office worked with the government of Brazil that looked at issues of recycling, reuse, responsible consumption, and disposal. So just a few ideas as to what that plan looked like. In the case of Belize, their action plan was actually linked to a national environmental policy, and the plan focused on 5 key areas: waste removal, outreach and education, land-based sources, sea-based sources, and importantly, marine science. In the case of Panama, one of the key elements I wanted to highlight here was how inclusive the development of the plan was, including not just government agencies, but non-governmental organizations, indigenous leaders, academia, and private sector. Again, important to consolidate around a common vision, which was minimizing the impacts on coastal and marine ecosystems. And some of their priority areas included financing, research, development, innovation, as well as awareness raising, education, legislation, governance, and cleanup. I wanted to put this slide in because as we've been talking about some of the policies, as we reviewed some of the policies and legislation that countries had put in place, we realized that there still needed to be significant focus on a life cycle approach, a circular economy approach, and looking at addressing the plastics pollution upstream. And I think we heard examples from Dominican Republic, from Colombia, on how important that is. And for that, we really need close engagement with industry. We need multidisciplinary research, so not just the environmental scientists, but also economists and social scientists, so that we can better understand and make efforts at the behavioral change that is so needed. For many of the small islands in particular that do not manufacture single-use plastics, then we also have to look at trade, and we have to look at it at a regional level. Antigua and Barbuda, in terms of best practices, was actually one of the first countries in the Caribbean to ban the import of plastics. This was based on a legislation and regulations that they put in place. They had a phased implementation to the ban, starting off with certain plastics products, and over a period of 2 to 3 years, they put in place measures to also address other sources of single-use plastics. In the case of the Bahamas, again, it started off with an announcement. They started off with a ban. They put in place a legislation. They addressed, first of all, what they thought were the most problematic issues: plastic bags, straws, styrofoam cups, and food containers. Interestingly, Bahamas was one of the few which we reviewed that made specific reference to the prohibition of the release of balloons into the air. And that was interesting. We didn't find that in many of the other countries. But again, they also saw the need to very clearly define what was biodegradable, oxo-biodegradable, non-biodegradable. And I think this is critical to address possible issues of greenwashing. Belize again started off with a certain focus on the most significant single-use plastics, looking at single-use styrofoam, plastic plates, bowls. And in fact, as we went through each of the countries, we noticed quite a lot of similarity in terms of how they address their national policies to look at the issue of plastics and microplastics. Some went into more detail in defining what those products would be, but we also noticed that over time, many of the countries have had to update or adjust the national policies and regulations. I've put in Barbados as an interesting case. The efforts taken to ban single-use plastics were very similar to the other countries, but I wanted to highlight in particular what happened as a result of COVID. And in fact, COVID did have a significant impact in the enforcement of some of the bans that had been put in place. For example, in Barbados, they restricted the use of reusable bags at markets and shops due to the worries that they could spread COVID-19. So you would see that despite some efforts at national level, sometimes the external environment does result in some change. Grenada, again, very much a phased process, starting with a piece of legislation that was put in place. They also looked at the issue of styrofoam, and now they are moving into a second phase in terms of banning the importation or production of plastic utensils. As I mentioned, there's a lot going on in the region. We didn't want to go into every single country, but I wanted to highlight that there are opportunities for sharing and learning of experiences. And I wanted to highlight a particular study that was done in Jamaica that personally I thought was a very interesting approach, and I think an important best practice that could be considered. They looked at a regulatory impact assessment of the single-use plastic ban to see how it would affect not just the society, the general public, but also the private sector. And this is a way of assessing whether or not the policy or legislation was most effective. What were some of the lessons learned and best practices? Effective communication. And we've heard this throughout the 5 days of this webinar. It is critical. There is some value in having preparatory time to ensure that, for example, suitable alternatives are identified. But it was also realized that we can't lose momentum. And it was suggested that perhaps For most of the countries that updated their policy, there was at least a year of leading time. The governments and the countries that were most successful had high-level political support and champions. Many of them have adopted a phased approach to implementation. What we see that has been lacking so far is the monitoring and evaluation of the effectiveness of some of these single-use plastic bans. And then we see the important need of bridging science and policy. Do we have the research that will actually need to inform other policies working? Are we identifying where the correct interventions are most needed? Are we looking at the entire life cycle of plastics? While this webinar is focused a bit on the end of pipe monitoring, which is taking place in terms of microplastics monitoring, we have to consider issues such as the importation, the manufacturing, the sale, the distribution, etc. of plastics, and to recognize that changing behavior is not an overnight process. We have to ensure that we have the right incentives and disincentives in place, not just for the general public, but also the business sector. And this is where I want to reiterate the call for multidisciplinary research that brings together our social scientists, our behavioral scientists, together with our environmental scientists. I wanted to end this part on the policy by touching a little bit in terms of what have been some of the best practices that we were able to identify at the global level, and most of these among developed countries. Many of them conducted very detailed baseline assessments to identify which categories of plastics were most commonly found and which ones were likely to have the greatest environmental and human health impact. They did a lot more detailed analysis as to what were the policy options that could be implemented, and therefore which would be the most appropriate ones to implement at a local or national level. And then they did sustainable development impacts of the various options through ongoing monitoring and evaluation. And if we as a region need to take some of the lessons learned from where these policies have been more successful, I would say these are some of the areas that we have to look at. In terms of the findings then, I would reiterate what we've heard throughout the webinar. We do need to have more collaboration among scientists, policymakers, exchanging best practices, but recognizing that the sociocultural context is important. We saw that the countries that had greater consultation and engagement prior to implementing policy and legislative reforms tended to have more success than using a more top-down approach. We need to ensure we have alternatives. And for those countries who had challenges, it was because alternatives were not suitably identified. We need then to ensure that the policy, legislation, and incentives are consistent and are helping moving the behavioral change to using these more environmental friendly alternatives. Awareness and marketing of alternatives are critical, and stakeholders need to be involved and informed of the process from the start to the end. And therefore, again, the importance of research and science in informing that. What are some of the recommendations that we came up with from looking at the entire work? Certainly, there is a need for us just to eliminate unnecessary problematic plastic packaging. And many governments are moving in that area. We need to put in place necessary standards to reduce the need for single-use plastics, to incentivize the use of reusable, recyclable, or compostable packaging. Basic waste management needs to improve, whether or not it's collection, sorting, reuse, recycling. The infrastructure, cost recovery, sustainable financing all need to be improved, as well as stimulating the demand for recycled products. And that's where the extended producer responsibility aspects need to come in. Again, I made a comment earlier this week. I am convinced that we need to do more in terms of the science, research, monitoring, and assessment that needs to feed into these policy decisions. And again, I would endorse the recommendation that many of the speakers made in terms of harmonized approaches, between different laboratories looking at microplastics. So in the last 5 minutes or so, I'm just going to highlight very quickly a couple of project opportunities that I thought important for all of the participants and some of the speakers to be aware of. This was a partnership we had with the U.S. Environment Protection Agency on a trash-free initiative. You would see some of the practical activities that were done on the ground with civil society in Jamaica, as well as private sector, and some of the actual achievements in terms of waste management, the amount of bottles collected, the awareness campaigns, the compost that was produced, and the training that was provided to residents. And then we have some ongoing projects. This is one that's targeting all of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific islands, being funded by the European Union. We have supported work in developing a national marine litter action plan in St. Lucia. We are currently working to support the government of Dominican Republic in improving its implementation of the Basel Convention on ship-generated waste. And we are doing a number of community-based waste management products that have been facilitated through our regional node. A much larger project funded by the Global Environment Facility, which is just about to begin, will be implemented in Colombia, Jamaica, and Panama. It will support governance, private sector engagement, circular economy, as well as capacity development. United Nations Environment Program will be the lead implementing agency, while the Cartagena Convention Secretariat will be supporting execution. Another project focusing on marine litter prevention, funded by the government of Germany, is benefiting 8 countries within Latin America and the Caribbean, including a number of Caribbean small islands. Again, we'll be looking at aspects relating to stakeholder awareness raising, databases and monitoring, intervention on the ground pilot sites using a circular economy approach, as well as facilitating transnational policy dialogue. And finally, there is a project that's being funded by the European Union that is supporting all of the smaller islands, including Haiti and the Dominican Republic, as well as Cuba, in implementing sustainable waste management, looking at improving legal and strategic frameworks, as well as strengthening circular economy approaches. So in summary, there are challenges, but we've certainly seen that there are ongoing activities that I believe are not always as adequately communicated to all of the stakeholders. I think there are still gaps that we need to address, but I am certainly encouraged by the presentations that I've heard over the last 5 days. And as has been said by the Senator earlier today, with collaboration among the agencies and among the projects, I think that we are in an excellent position to address this very challenging issue. So thank you so much again to the organizers for allowing me to share some of our experiences, and I'm open to any questions that colleagues might have. Over. Muchísimas gracias para las palabras. Yo vi una pregunta sobre, yes, the availability of where we have all of this information regarding the single-use plastic and ban policies. We had started to develop an interactive map at the Secretariat to try to document all of the countries within the wider Caribbean region that had banned single-use plastics, and also to provide links to where those policies could be found. Our colleagues at our regional office in Panama had also done something similar. So I would say that probably give us another month or so, and we plan to consolidate that information and be able to provide that. I think that's a really important point that has been made by Virginia, that a lot of times people are looking for examples of what other countries have done so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. So we are working to consolidate that now, and as soon as we have something available, we would be definitely sharing through our various networks and certainly with our colleagues at the ACS. And perhaps we can also share with all of the presenters here. A question about and I don't know, puedo continuar con la respuesta a las preguntas. I've started to answer the questions, but I realize I have not given the moderator the opportunity. But if they would like me, because I do have the chat open, so if I miss any, please let me know, but I can continue. Yes, in terms of ratification of the LBS protocol, I would say that it is something that the Secretariat is working very diligently on with all of the governments who have not yet ratified the protocol. Some have also not ratified our marine biodiversity protocol. What we have been doing over the last few years is trying to identify what have been some of the barriers to ratification. Many governments who have not yet ratified have indicated to us that in some cases they don't have the necessary policy and legislation in place. In some cases, some governments have indicated to us that it is not a significant political priority at this time. But I think now that we are addressing pollution in such an integrated manner, and because we have been able to provide direct support to governments through the different projects that we are doing, we are seeing signs that more governments are now interested in ratifying. The other aspect of the protocol that's a little challenging for some governments is that I believe particularly for the Spanish-speaking countries, once ratification takes place, the obligations of the legal instrument become automatic at a national level. And a few governments were concerned that particularly some of their regulations relating to wastewater management would not be able to meet the requirements of the protocol. Again, we are working with some of those governments to try to address that. Once you experience what is lacking, what do you see significant for a reduction of the thank you, Dalia, in terms of the question relating to what is really lacking now. I think what we found certainly at looking at all of the countries within Latin America and the Caribbean region, we need to do a better job in terms of management of waste. And I think that was mentioned, and this does not only apply to plastic. So this is just our domestic waste management. It has to improve from collection to transport to disposal. We have to reduce on the littering that is taking place. We have to make sure that proper systems are put in place in our landfills and to reduce the amount of open dump sites. We also have to put in place better measures to deal with any pollution, any discharge of garbage that's coming from ships. We have international agreements to deal with them, but perhaps they're not being as enforced at the national or regional level. So that's around the waste management discussion as solid waste. Then we need to look at the more life cycle approaches that relates to plastic production. And that's where, as a region and as small islands, we have to rely a lot on what's happening within the global community. We have to really lobby very strongly, in my opinion, for a strong international legal agreement that puts pressure in terms of dealing with plastics upstream. Many of the countries in our region are importers of plastic material, and therefore, how are we going to reduce plastics if we don't have the capacity and the infrastructure for recycling, or where the cost of return is so expensive? for those countries within Latin America and the Caribbean that are involved in plastic production, those are the ones we have to work with now to develop alternatives. What are suitable alternatives so they can transition out of plastics into something else that is more environmentally friendly. So as a region, we have not, I would say, significantly engaged with the large plastic, but at the country level, there has been some engagement with the commercial providers. So there's some projects I know in small island, Panama and Colombia, where they are working with the importers to try to have some form of measures put in place that would restrict certain types of plastic being imported into the country and the use of certain plastic. But that's where, again, I think regional approaches are going to be important. We need to be able to have some form of harmonize so that the big industry players don't play one country off another. So if a single country has a lower standard than another one, it could create some challenges because ultimately all of us are going to be impacted by pollution of the Caribbean Sea. Exactly. We don't want to create a race to the bottom and have the lowest common denominator being used to, and as we've seen, once the plastics enter, once any pollutant enters into the Caribbean Sea, it is going to affect us, whether or not it's human health, our marine biota, our biodiversity, or our livelihoods, whether it be fishing, tourism, maritime transportation. So very much so. Bueno, muchas gracias a todos for the questions and free to contact me. I'll put my contact information in the chat. And I also encourage anyone to check on the different resources that we have available. And some of those will be shared, I think, at the end of this conference as well. So thanks again. And Madam Facilitator, Chair, back over to you.
Hola, buenos días. Antes de presentar compartir con ustedes mi punto de vista de estos 5 días de trabajo, quiero nuevamente resaltar el enorme trabajo que ha llevado a cabo la Asociación de Estados Miembros del Caribe a través de la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores de México. Y la gente que nos integramos durante varios meses, Leti, a formar este gran seminario internacional. Quiero resaltar tu paciencia, Leti, tu paciencia que nos fuiste llevando durante al menos 8 sesiones de trabajo, y es algo que aprecio mucho porque yo no tengo paciencia. Entonces, entre otras cosas, tu profesionalismo y tu paciencia han permitido que construyamos juntos en el Caribe este gran seminario. Bien, a tu pregunta detonadora que formulas, desde mi punto de vista, yo veo lo siguiente. Con este seminario y a lo largo de estos días, varios de nosotros nos hemos conocido, algunos nos hemos vuelto a ver nuevamente, pero independientemente de esto, es obvio que existe experiencia sobre este tema en la región. Este seminario ha permitido poner en un mismo espacio a esta experiencia que tenemos en la región en este tema. Los participantes, todos ellos, con sus presentaciones, nos demuestran lo consolidado que tienen su camino. Nos han ido mostrando sus resultados. Con esto deseo resaltar que hay un interés en la región, tanto científico como de gestión, sobre el tema de plásticos y microplásticos. Las políticas internacionales y nacionales hoy las escuchamos a través de Cris y la senadora Paredes. Entonces la gran pregunta es, ¿qué nos falta? Porque todos nosotros vivimos en el Caribe y todos seguimos viendo esas montañas interminables de basura y los problemas que tenemos en todos los países, desde los insulares del Caribe hasta un país tan grandote como puede ser México con su Caribe continental, y que estamos en una situación idéntica, con un exceso de residuos sólidos donde la mayoría son plásticos y plásticos de un solo uso. Yo veo que lo que nos hace falta es un programa integral a nivel del Caribe de excelente comunicación. Una comunicación que tiene que ser en diferentes ejes. La comunicación técnico-científica, la tuvimos en este seminario, esa la sabemos hacer bien. Yo diría la comunicación que señalaba la senadora Paredes esta mañana, que vaya hacia la educación, hacia los programas educativos desde el nivel escolar básico hasta el nivel preparatorio, y que formen parte de esta iniciativa de Naciones Unidas donde el desarrollo sostenible debe de enseñarse en las escuelas. Es una materia en México, están obligados a enseñar, pero pues se toca porque es una obligación sin realmente haber un programa bien estructurado de cambio climático y contaminación, sobre utilización de recursos del Caribe, entre otros temas. Entonces creo que ese tiene que ser un excelente programa de comunicación. El otro que ha sido también señalado es a la sociedad. A la sociedad tenemos que comunicarle de otra manera, ¿sí? La pregunta aquí es ¿por qué nosotros como ciudadanos seguimos consumiendo de la misma manera? Dicho lo anterior, independientemente del cambio individual que queramos hacer cada uno de nosotros, tenemos el mercado que nos vende de una manera. Creo que ahí tenemos que trabajar mucho. Si yo voy al supermercado en México, yo salgo con residuos sólidos. O al menos que hagamos una iniciativa como lo hizo Alemania, donde quita todos los embalajes y se los deja al supermercado diciendo, ya me lo vendiste, ya me lo cobraste, es tu responsabilidad. Esas son acciones mediáticas, pero que no van a cambiar. Si yo voy al mercado de mi colonia, de mi barrio, ahí puedo ir con una bolsa y puedo regresar con las zanahorias, las papas, la lechuga, los jitomates, sin bolsas de plástico, pero cada vez ese mercado es más reducido. Entonces creo que tenemos que comunicar mucho a nivel de la sociedad, a nivel del mercado y a nivel de los tomadores de decisiones. La información es la misma, pero la manera de comunicarlo a esos 4 ejes creo que es el gran acierto que podría tener, entre otros, este gran ejercicio que han llevado a cabo ustedes como Asociación de Estados Miembros del Caribe. Gracias. Paso el micrófono.
Muchas gracias, muy amable. Quiero agradecer las excelentes presentaciones de hoy en el seminario, que son verdaderamente cruciales para poder enfrentar el efecto del plástico en la vida del ser humano. Y quería hacer un breve, muy breve comentario. El señor Chris Corbin del Programa Mundial de las Naciones Unidas para el Medio Ambiente habló sobre el esfuerzo a nivel internacional como una cosa básica para encontrar soluciones globales a los problemas internacionales. Y yo quería hacerles un comentario muy breve en el sentido que en el 2021 el Perú junto con Ruanda y un grupo de países con ideas afines presentó un proyecto de resolución destinado a acabar con la contaminación por plásticos y para iniciar las negociaciones de un instrumento mundial jurídicamente vinculante para abordar esta crisis ambiental. El proyecto de resolución fue apoyado por más de 60 países de diferentes regiones del mundo y permitió la adopción de una resolución, la resolución 5/14 titulada Acabar con la contaminación por plásticos hacia un instrumento internacional jurídicamente vinculante. Esta resolución estableció el Comité Intergubernamental de Negociación con el mandato de forjar un instrumento internacional jurídicamente vinculante para acabar con la contaminación por plásticos. En este momento el Perú es miembro del Buró del Comité Intergubernamental de Negociación y ha presentado la candidatura del ex canciller Gustavo Meza Cuadra para presidir el referido buró. Yo lo que quiero destacar no es solamente la capacidad, el brillante trabajo multilateral del embajador Meza Cuadra, que ha participado en importantísimas negociaciones multilaterales en la ONU, sino que quería destacar que es necesario una decisión de toda la región de América Latina sobre la presidencia del Buró para antes de la primera sesión del Comité Intergubernamental de Negociación que se va a realizar en Punta del Este desde el 26 de este mes al 2 de diciembre. El Perú espera que el GRULA adopte una posición sólida y unificada a favor de un candidato único a la presidencia del Buró en representación de la región de Latinoamérica y del Caribe, y en este sentido agradecerá mucho el valioso apoyo de los miembros de la Asociación de los Estados del Caribe. Gracias por permitirme hacer esta breve intervención sobre la urgente acción internacional que es necesaria para enfrentar el plástico. Gracias, muy amable.
Thank you very much again. Just to really appreciate, I think what an excellent set of discussions we've had over the last 5 days, and I have a few reflections as well. First of all, I want to indicate that this was one of the few webinars and seminars where we have got to hear the actual work that is being done on the ground by the scientists and the researchers and by the policy makers. So it was not just about theory, it was about the experiences and the challenges that we have within the Latin America and Caribbean region, and the priorities which we have moving forward. And therefore I wanted to use that as an entry point to the comment that was just made by the ambassador of Peru, that as a region, we need to be very well prepared and to speak in a common voice when we start the international negotiations for this binding treaty. I know time is not with us, but it would be excellent if some of the information that has been presented by the various scientists and researchers about the state of plastic pollution in the Caribbean Sea can actually be used to inform our negotiators when they participate in these international negotiations. So I do want to strongly support the sentiments made by the Honorable Ambassador. The second point I wanted to reflect on really related to the network of scientists and the friendships and the collaboration that we have forged during this webinar. We heard of the work that was being done in Remarco led by INVIMA, and we also heard of the interest by many of the researchers from the Caribbean small islands as to how they could participate so that we could have more harmonized approaches to monitoring of microplastics in the environment. And this is something that I think should be a very strong recommendation coming out of this seminar. And as I mentioned earlier this week, at a secretariat level, we would be very interested in promoting the expansion of Remarco to consider English-speaking countries as well. The third reflection, Chair, really relates to the fact that many of us are involved in different governance fora. We have the ACS, we have our own convention, we have UNEP's meeting of Latin America and the Caribbean, we have the Central American Commission, we have the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. And I think it's important at a governance level, at a political level, that we also have some consistent messaging about this issue, because this issue is both a scientific issue, as we've heard, it's an issue for society and private sector, but it's also an issue at the governance level. And it would be good for us as those intergovernmental organizations to have some level of consistency in the message and the decisions that we receive from our constituents. Just two final points quickly, Chair. One is I think we all have to commit to showcase some of the excellent work that is going on in the region. I don't think perhaps we are doing enough of it. We are guilty of that as well. And I think we need to find ways so that it makes it easier to facilitate the exchange of best practices and experiences and lessons learned, even on the policy side, but also on the scientific side. And the final point, as we heard when I saw the presentation from our Basel Center in Trinidad, is that we have many projects working on similar things. And we need to have a way of collaborating on those projects so that we don't duplicate and overlap, but rather look to synergize and enhance. So those are just a few reflections. I just want to thank the ACS, the government of Mexico, through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, all of the experts who participated in the webinar. Thank you so much.
Gracias, Leti. Me gustaría hacer un resumen de productos que veo muy sencillos que pueden derivar de este gran seminario internacional. El primero de ellos, obviamente, vamos a llamarle el libro o el atlas derivado de estos 5 días de trabajo, ¿no? En algún formato digital puede estar, ¿no? Eso me parece muy valioso, poderlo poner, hacerlo visible y difundirlo. Otra cosa que me parece que podemos retomar es esta reunión que sugería la senadora Paredes de utilizar el Parlamento de América Latina y el Caribe, donde están los legisladores de estos países, con la comunidad científica, ir hacia la propuesta, como ella decía, al menos de una acción sencilla en donde se comprometan estos países a implementar. Creo que es otro producto que no le veo mayor dificultad con la experiencia que ustedes tienen de organizar, y el formato virtual ayuda y reduce nuestra huella de CO2, entre otras cosas, y la económica. Ese es el segundo producto. El tercer producto que yo veo es podernos constituir con la cobija de ustedes en una red, en este caso científico-técnica, ¿no? Después se puede ampliar esa red, puede tener después el eje de legisladores, el eje de la sociedad civil, el eje de la ciudadanía, lo que ustedes quieran, que la podemos llamar COCA, ¿no? Contaminación del Caribe. Esa es otra red que ayuda mucho el estar estructurados en una red, en donde obviamente hay productos, hay acciones, hay compromisos. Otra cosa que no hemos tocado es la comunicación de la experiencia que tenemos para pensar en un programa de posgrado con diferentes universidades de la región. Existimos, profesionalmente existimos, las personas están consolidados. Sería realmente fortalecer la infraestructura de laboratorios, equipos, experiencia que tenemos en la región hacia un posgrado internacional del Caribe con el gran tema de cambio climático y contaminación marina, no solamente por plásticos, en donde nuestros estudiantes pudieran al menos realizar 1 o 2 viajes en el par de años que dura un programa de posgrado. Esa formación sería muy fortalecida, ¿sí? Hoy en día, repito, a través de los cursos online, pues podemos tener estudiantes que están inscritos en México, en el CINVESTAV, por ejemplo, pero tienen 2 o 3 cursos que lo están llevando con profesores de Colombia o profesores de las Antillas Francesas. El diploma, pues lleva esas 3, 4, 5 instituciones que participan. Y eso también al joven le da una posibilidad laboral mucho más sólida e internacional. El otro producto que veo ese hay que trabajar un poco más en la búsqueda de recursos, es al menos realizar un monitoreo, ¿sí? A nivel del Gran Caribe, por ejemplo, siguiendo esos grandes ejes de circulación oceánica que tiene el Mar Caribe. Uno, con la misma metodología, con lo mismo esfuerzo, ¿sí? Más monitoreos en cada uno de nuestros países que nos den la radiografía, ¿sí? Puntual, pero una radiografía del estado de contaminación del Caribe en este tema de microplásticos. Y obviamente poder consolidarnos hacia la búsqueda de fondos europeos para seguir realizando nuestro trabajo científico y consolidando. Esa es una lista de productos que veo que no veo mucha complicación de poderlo llevar a cabo. Gracias. El micrófono lo regreso a la Secretaría.
Perdón, estaba apagado el micrófono. Agradecerle la palabra y a la vez de felicitar a los expositores por el gran contenido del material que nos fue presentado y los análisis. Lo que hace falta es también la divulgación de esta problemática. Tal vez a través de programas como PNUMA puede pagarse o contratarse espacios en la televisión por cable para que documentales que pongan de manifiesto los niveles dramáticos de contaminación que existe no solo en el mar, sino con los microplásticos y todo el material de desecho sólido flotante, que también las personas pues tomen conciencia de eso. Es necesario la divulgación a nivel educativo, o sea, en las escuelas de educación primaria, en las escuelas de educación secundaria, para que estas generaciones que vienen detrás de nosotros tengan la conciencia del cuidado del planeta, del mar, de los océanos, que es donde se supone está, digamos, el alimento del futuro en muchas de sus manifestaciones. Entonces, nuevamente felicitarlos por esta organización de este taller y ojalá que pronto podamos ver a más nivel la diseminación de estas informaciones para que, digamos, los actores que son los que están en las cuencas, en tierra, en los litorales, se unan a esta lucha que les afecta directamente a ellos y también a toda la humanidad. Muchas gracias y feliz tarde.
Hello, can you hear me? Thank you again for the opportunity. I just want to add what Dalila has told us about the post-graduation courses in exchanges between the countries of Latin America and Europe and the US and so on. Because it's, as we saw here, it's a transboundary issue. It's an international problem. It's not only from the island countries, but not only the states from the wider Caribbean region, but it has these interactions with adjacent areas and neighboring areas. So we saw the case of the Brazilian coast, the possible contribution from the US, like the Mississippi Basin. So this does not regard only the countries from the wider Caribbean region, but an even larger area. So we are available for collaborations in the near future. Thank you.
Gracias, secretaria. Hemos resaltado el tema de comunicación y realmente nos hace falta, ¿no? Comunicar es un arte, definitivamente es un arte. Yo no tengo los dotes musicales para entonar la música de Despacito, pero si yo les pregunto a todos los que estamos ahorita enlazados que por favor, nada más para hacer un test, con su manita levanten los que conocemos esa canción, me gustaría ver si estoy en lo cierto o no. ¿Quién conoce la canción de Despacito? Bueno, ya se están prendiendo las manos. Bueno, muy bien, ¿no? O sea, no tengo la entonación, pero sin embargo, pues las manos se están levantando. Entonces, dicho esto, lo que yo quiero señalar es que en ayer hablábamos de que el Caribe se escribe con C. en donde hay cooperación, hay confianza, hay cariño, pero también es un camino, el Caribe es un camino que estamos construyendo y en ese camino de construcción la comunicación es fundamental. Hemos hablado de la comunicación y repito, la información que se transmite es la misma, pero la manera en que se va a transmitir es completamente diferente. Tenemos que vincular esa comunicación al mercado, a las empresas, a los que producen los productos, a quienes no lo venden, a los tomadores de decisiones, y eso es otra manera de comunicar, a todos los ministerios de educación. Se nos es más fácil a los científicos, docentes, de tener ese vínculo. ¿Por qué no, Leti? Una super reunión invitando a los ministerios de educación pública de nuestros países Caribe, con el staff técnico, algunos de los que hemos participado en para transmitir este tema y que forme parte de su currícula a los niños, a los jóvenes, hasta la media superior. La sociedad, a la sociedad, la que compra, la que entra al supermercado, a las tiendas, la gente que se viste de moda porque quiere, el que lo anhela, pues también tenemos que educar mucho. Ayer veía un programa europeo donde hay una aplicación y la idea es transmitirle al ciudadano pues la huella que va dejando de CO2, no solamente, ¿sí?, de plástico, sino de todo aquello que compra, ¿no? Entonces, esta iniciativa, con esta aplicación, cada cosa que compra nueva, pues tiene una carga de CO2. Esa carga de CO2 está expresado en kilos, ¿no? Y le dan una mochila, por ejemplo, con 20 kilos, y le dicen, bueno, pues mira, la playerita que te acabas de comprar, que pesa 20 gramos, pues tuvo, ¿sí?, para su fabricación, ¿sí?, entre agua, energía, todo eso, 20 kilos. Entonces carga esa mochilita 20 kilos. Y así de esa manera, pues van creando una conciencia de todo lo que implica comprar, ¿sí?, en esta línea recta, comprar y desechar, comprar y desechar. Y estamos ante el reto, en el Caribe no hay espacio para la basura, ¿sí? Varios de los países exportan ya su basura. Bien, tenemos que educar entonces de otra manera a la sociedad, al turismo, a todas las empresas que participan en el turismo en el Caribe, que va desde el chiquito hasta los grandes cruceros. Ahí también tenemos que estar presentes. Ahí hay que transmitirle que esos cruceros tienen que vendernos sus cruceros de otra manera, ¿sí?, con otro tipo de insumos, no los que están llevando a cabo, y que no es pagando que se resuelve el problema. Y otro que no hemos sido citado, pero que es muy importante, que en nuestra región es muy importante, es el sector pesquero. Ustedes saben que el sector pesquero es uno de los sectores que contribuye con plástico. Entonces tenemos varios ejes en los que podemos comunicar, y dentro de esa comunicación, por ejemplo, a la sociedad, ¿cómo me gustaría que a algunos de nuestros cantantes que tenemos en el Caribe, que son extraordinarios, con ese tipo de mosaicos que se dieron ahora en la pandemia, donde participan unos 10 de diferentes países y cantan una sola canción, es algo que creo que sería muy emotivo, es algo que en mis sueños, que siempre tengo sueños, ¿por qué no en un par de años estemos todos cantando una de esas canciones que nos mueva de que tenemos que consumir definitivamente de otra manera? No solamente es llevar a hacer una gestión de los desechos, sino que ya no tenemos que fabricar más productos que van a ser un desecho. Gracias, Leti. Micrófono a la secretaria.